have clients with an assortment of different lifestyle conditions. And my goal is to help them not only manage these modern chronic diseases, but also reverse them and lose stubborn weight and just optimize their life in every way and feel their best. So many of my clients assume that because of their genes and their family history that poor health is inevitable. But through my program, I have proved to them that our genes may load the gun, but it is our lifestyle that's pulling the trigger. So where do we begin? There's so much information out there today, lots of conflicting information. 1 minute fat is bad, the next is good, and it's very confusing for people to navigate. So it makes sense to look to our biology and evolution for some guidance. So what is the optimal human diet? For 2.6 million years, our paleo ancestors thrived off the animals that they hunted and the plants that they foraged. And it's only been the last 10,000 years that the modern agricultural revolution has been around. So only for the last 10,000 years have we been cultivating crops, domesticating livestock, genetically modifying our food. The list goes on and on. So it's safe to assume that our genes are well adapted to this paleo diet formula, and not so well adapted to the more recent changes to our food environment. So I'm going to provide some evidence. There's a lot of research on modern hunter-gatherer societies living on the planet. And what they find time and time again is that these tribes who are still eating their traditional diet, who haven't adopted the modern westernized diet, are free of modern disease. They aren't suffering from heart disease. There is no type 2 diabetes, no mental health troubles. Those are practically non-existent, and that is very, very revealing. Another piece of evidence is that when they look at the remains of Paleolithic skeletons, it shows that they were in very good health. They didn't have any cavities, they had strong muscle attachments, strong bones. It looked as though they were very well nourished. Versus the Neolithic skeletal remains, which is once they adopted farming and started to cultivate those crops, they were starting to limit their variety, and there were implications to this. They're pretty much the opposite of the skeletal remains of the Paleolithic humans. They showed signs of malnutrition. Their teeth showed lots of cavities. Their height, so their stature, it decreased on average by 5.6%, both in men and women, which is a big drop. There were signs of infection and just signs that they weren't getting their nutrients. Their nutrient needs were not being met. So I think that is very interesting. Next is that once the arrival of Paleolithic humans into a new geographical area, there was animal extinction. So animal extinction would occur after they inhabited a new area. And what this tells us is that animal protein was highly sought after by our ancestors, and that we were at the top of the food chain. More evidence. I want to give you guys lots of evidence. And something else that happened that's very important during this time period is that our brain size increased dramatically. So we had the tools to carve meat and get to that good fatty bone marrow inside the bones. And the control of fire allowed our Paleolithic ancestors to reduce the toxic burden of the foods that they were eating, kill off some of that bacteria, and it also makes foods more digestible when we're cooking them. And more digestible means more nutrients, that we are absorbing, as well as more calories. And those calories were able to go to our brain so that we could evolve as a species. Next is a study on, again, recent hunter-gatherer societies in the world. And what they found is that 73% of these societies get more than half of their calories from meat. So again, animal protein, highly sought after. It's a very nutrient-dense calorie source for people, for our Paleolithic ancestors, and yeah, they like it, I guess. And it's good to note that they're not just eating chicken. You know, they're getting a very large variety, everything from porcupine to, you know, the proteins that we're familiar with. Another interesting fact is that all mammals have similar macronutrient needs. So there's a difference between food and nutrients. So the foods that we put in our mouth may be very different. Gorillas are eating vegetation, we are having more of a variety. But what those foods break down to after the digestive process occurs, that is what is very similar across the mammals. And we'll get more into that in a couple of slides. So last one on this is, again, more recent evidence of modern hunter-gatherer societies, about 229 Aboriginal groups. And the evidence shows that once they begin to stray from their traditional diet, then they start to adopt the modern diseases that many people are suffering with today. So once they fall into the westernized diet culture, and the diseases start to appear, when those diseases were not present in their culture prior to that. Okay, so what I did here on this pie chart is I looked at the macronutrients. So again, after the foods were broken down by digestion, macronutrient composition of carnivores, herbivores, and omnivores. I also took the composition of the human body, because during the Paleolithic period, it was in our best interest to be well adapted to cannibalize, is I guess the nicest way I could put it, our own bodies and use our stores for fuel, because there were times of famine and we still had to be able to get out there and hunt and gather and get more food on the table. So I think that's a good sign of what our body can easily use for energy and what it prefers. And last is human breast milk, which is the perfect food for growing babies. So it makes sense that that would be pretty similar to what us as adults need as well. So what we find based on these averages is that the macronutrient ratio is very similar across all of these different groups. And the evidence shows that we are getting about over 50% of our diet from healthy fats. And that is monounsaturated fats like olive oil and fatty fish for a lot of our ancestors, as well as saturated fats, which we're getting a lot of those good fats from animal protein and coconuts and things like that. And then a pretty even ratio between carbohydrates and protein. And then PUFAs, those are polyunsaturated fats, and our ancestors would get those fats from seeds and nuts mostly. We just need a small amount of those to sustain life. Do you guys feel like that's pretty similar to what our diet looks like today? Do you think pretty far off? Yeah. So essentially, our ancestors and this evidence shows that we should be eating what we are. I'm not saying that we should eat fat because, you know, we are fat. I'm not calling anyone fat here. What I'm saying is that our body is mostly made up of fat. There are fatty membranes around our cells. Our brain is primarily made of fat. There's a lot of fat in our muscle tissue. And this is just evidence that our body likes these healthy fats for fuel. So what happens when we stray from our evolutionary diet? we can look at gorillas in the zoo and see what happens when they're displaced, when they're removed from their wild traditional environment. Their evolutionary diet shifts dramatically. So from getting over half of their calories from fiber, which is converted in the digestive tract into fatty acids, they're getting over half of their diet from fiber in the wild, and about 16% from carbs, and that's from vegetation and wild fruits. So in the zoo, they're being fed the opposite of that diet, very different from their natural diet. Only about 14% of fiber, and as I just mentioned, their biology is such that they need that fiber to convert it to those fatty acids for energy. So less fiber means less energy for these gorillas. And the carbs that they're getting way more than they've ever had before, and more than they need, and a much lower quality, refined carbohydrates and sweet domesticated fruits. So kind of sad, a third of them are dying from heart disease, and many of them experience a lot of the same health complications that people experience today: high triglycerides, high cholesterol, abnormal behaviors like plucking their own hair out, and also regurgitating, and just signs of distress and malnourishment. But there's a happy ending to this story. For at least a lot of the gorillas, they have transitioned them back to their evolutionary diet, giving them more dandelion greens and romaine, and getting that fiber intake up. And when they do this, then the obesity rates of these gorillas goes down. All of those biomarkers that were elevated are going down, and they're regaining their health. So, like the gorillas in the zoo, we are getting a diet that is very far from our evolutionary norm. One being that we are getting a lot more carbohydrates. Okay? The Nurses' Health Study shows that the group that had the high carb intake, they smoked less, they exercised more, but regardless of these healthy behaviors, they still experienced a 42% higher risk of heart attack. So this is a little telling that maybe our bodies and our biology aren't really designed to process that many carbohydrates. And it's also important to note the quality of these carbohydrates. Our ancestors were getting them from vegetables and from roots and tubers, and today they're manufactured and very far from natural, very refined. Next is vegetable oils. So if you remember that little sliver on the pie chart that I showed you guys earlier, we need a small amount of those polyunsaturated fats. And before we were getting them from nuts and seeds, but today we're getting them from refined vegetable oils. And we're getting a lot more than we need. So if you eat foods that are prepackaged, if you eat at restaurants, if you eat fast food, chances are these are prepared in vegetable oil because it is cheap. But the research just shows that in both rodents and humans, when vegetable oil consumption goes up, so does our waistline. Next is a low-fat diet. So fat meaning those good, healthful fats that we talked about before, from fatty fish and from coconuts and from animal protein. So because of all of that misleading information out there, people get confused and don't really know, is fat good, is it bad? So the research tells us that women who adopt low-fat diets, who try to reduce their calories from fat, they increase the risk of infertility by 85%, versus women who are not trying to actively avoid that fat. So that's a little concerning. It shows, we need to be able to provide that baby with nutrients and vitamins, and if we are unable to do that, then our body will not support it. So it is a very good sign that those women who are opting for the lower dairy options were malnourished and needed more of that food. Okay, so you guys were right when you shook your heads about whether or not that other pie graph looks similar to our diet today. We have traded carbohydrates for fats, getting about half of our calories from carbohydrates. And again, they're not those roots and tubers and vegetables that our ancestors were eating, but they are the refined carbohydrates, the cereal grains, and all of those things. We've reduced our fat intake by about half, and the chances of us getting 30% of our fats from fatty meats and fatty fish is probably not likely in this day and age. It's probably coming from other sources. And our protein intake has gone down. So clearly the ratios here are off. So what are the repercussions of this? Well, just like the gorillas who have strayed from their evolutionary diet in the zoos, we too are experiencing cardiovascular disease. It's more than 65 million people in America suffering from cardiovascular disease, which is just unbelievable. Like the gorillas, when we are straying from our traditional diet, we are more prone to gaining weight. About 65% of adults in America are overweight, and 34% have metabolic syndrome. So that's a host of different chronic diseases, type 2 diabetes, high triglycerides, cholesterol, all that. So definitely alarming. So what do we do? What do we do about this? Do we try to eat more like the gorillas? Do we eat more meat? So let's take a look at the vegetarian diet and our biology and whether or not they're a good fit for one another. Chimpanzees are our closest animal relative, and they have a colon that is 3 times larger than ours. Okay? So this is what allows them to ferment all that fiber that they're eating in their gut and turn it into fatty acids, which we've discussed. Those fatty acids are a great source of energy for mammals. We, on the other hand, develop bigger brains. And I don't know about you guys, but I would choose bigger brain over the bigger colon any day. And our bigger brain requires more energy-dense foods. And we want to use our bigger brains. We don't want to have to be sitting around eating fibrous vegetables all day long. So we gain the ability to cook, and we have the technology to get those fattier meats, and that extra energy helped us to develop bigger brains and evolve as a species. So based on the evidence, based on our biology, it just makes sense that we are getting more of those energy-dense foods from animal protein or fattier fish. All right, so say we want to make all of these changes. You know, we're totally on board. It's a new year, it's a new us, but it is still America, and we are still surrounded by these foods everywhere, these processed foods, these highly palatable foods, foods that our ancestors, our primal ancestors, were never exposed to. These overwhelmingly sweet, salty, fatty treats that everyone is addicted to. You know, my clients, one of their biggest concerns is insatiable cravings. They're just constantly wanting more and more and more, and there's never that off switch. So this is working against us. Our brain has appetite regulating mechanisms. So, you know, our ghrelin, our hunger hormone, goes up when we are malnourished. And once our body is nourished, then our leptin, our satiety hormone, will go up and tell us, okay, it's time to stop eating. But unfortunately, we're eating these very calorie-dense foods, eating way more than we need. And at the same time, these foods are providing us with little to no nutrition. So this is really just a recipe for disaster, because our brain wants us to be well nourished, And that means that we're gonna have to keep eating more of these foods, trying our best to extract any nutrients we can from them, at the same time killing ourselves because we are just putting it on all this extra weight. And our primal brain is saying, okay, it's time to feast. Okay, we have this calorie dense resource, it's in our best interest to eat it all up and hoard it and put on that extra fat for when there is famine. But we don't have famine. At least it's not going to happen anytime in our lifetime, most likely. So we're not using up those fat stores for fuel. So they're just sitting there and accumulating. Okay, so I've told you all the things that are going on that are working against us. Now I want to share some tips on how to restore our primal palate and get back our natural appetite regulating hormones, get those ghrelin levels regulated so that our hunger is triggered when it should be, and that our satiety is triggered when it should be. So number one is getting plenty of those healthy fats that we've been talking about. So again, they are the body's preferred source of energy, okay? We are primarily made up of that fat, and so that during those times of famine, it's an easy source of fuel. So that's a sign that our body likes to digest that for energy. The fat can also be pushed to the liver, where it can be converted into ketones. So I'm sure many of you have probably heard of the ketogenic diet. So the idea behind that is that those fatty livers are transferred to the did I say fatty livers? Mm-hmm. Fatty acids are transferred to the liver, where they are turned into those ketones. And those ketones, they don't have to go through the blood to get those nutrients where they need to go. They can bypass the blood-brain barrier, and they just get right to the point, basically. And so they're really great for neurological conditions. I will prescribe this for people with migraines, for people who have had strokes, for basically depression, anxiety, anything neurological. It is really beneficial because our brain does have that barrier, so that parasites and things like that can't get to it. So being able to produce more ketones from our liver is getting then more nutrients to our brain. And fat is more satiating. So I always ask people, how easy is it to overeat a bag of potato chips? It's pretty darn easy. How easy is it to overeat a piece of salmon or a steak? Are we gonna, after we have our piece of salmon, are we gonna go back to the freezer and then defrost it and put it in the oven because we just gotta have more? Or is something gonna go off in our brain and say, that was good, I enjoyed that, and I don't need any more? So kind of trying to think of it that way. Obviously, our body is lacking this vital nutrient, and we need to be getting more of it, and that's gonna help to regulate those hunger hormones. Number two is flavor combinations. They're very, very rewarding for the brain. So not only does it increase their nourishment, because we cannot get all the vitamins and nutrients we need from one single food. And so it is in our best interest to get a good variety. And this is one of the main reasons why when they uncovered the remains of those skeletons from the Neolithic era who adopted farming, why their health deteriorated so much, because they were relying on just a few crops and a few domesticated animals instead of eating with the seasons and getting out there and gathering and getting a much larger variety of foods. They were relying on just a few different kinds. So they weren't getting as much nourishment. So I always tell my clients to eat the rainbow, eat all the different colors, because they all have different benefits. And by combining different foods, you're also reducing the toxicity. So bok choy, for example, it's a vegetable. It's considered pretty healthy, good to have every once in a while. But there is an 88-year-old Chinese woman in New York, I believe is where she was at, who was trying to control her blood sugar by eating 2 pounds of raw bok choy every day for a few months. And then she went into a thyroid-induced coma. So just goes to show the dose makes the poison, you know, in small amounts bok choy is helpful, in very large amounts it is very toxic. So it is in our best interest to spread it out and get a diversity. So combining different flavors also lowers the glycemic index. So I like to use the example of a baked potato. So baked potatoes are pretty high on the glycemic index, meaning that they're going to spike your blood sugars pretty rapidly. But if you add fats, so clarified butter, if you add acids like vinegar, if you add fiber, say maybe some broccoli to that baked potato, that's going to significantly decrease the glycemic response. Okay, and that's just much better for our body, and our pancreas is going to be very happy about that. So if blood sugars are a concern for you, if diabetes is in your family history, then making sure to combine those different foods, adding fats, things like that is definitely beneficial. And it just tastes better, you know? If I have clients who come to me after trying to do the wrong thing, eating chicken and broccoli every day for dinner, it's not satisfying, and eventually we're gonna feel deprived, and our brain's gonna tell us like, hey, just let loose, just, you know, whatever. But if you're getting a good variety and a good array of foods, and you're flavoring your foods well, and you're pairing them well, and making them delicious, then it's gonna be a lot more sustainable. Lastly is salt. So, a little controversial. I mean, anyone with high blood pressure knows probably want to stay away from excess salt in the diet. But most people villainize salt. And it's not so much the salt's fault, it's what we're eating the salt on today. So if you're frequently eating out at restaurants, dining out, eating processed foods from a package, chances are you're getting your sodium, you're meeting your sodium needs. But if you're cooking at home and you're preparing some salmon or some roasted vegetables, then it's okay to put a little bit of salt on there. Our body needs sodium. Sodium is an electrolyte that helps us to regulate fluids. So it is important. So if you're not eating lots of processed foods and eating out frequently and you're preparing most of your meals at home, put a little salt on it. Goes back to that higher satisfaction. If you make this food tastier, more enjoyable, then the odds of you sustaining that health behavior are better. Okay, so I don't have much time left. Really wanted to get into moving like our ancestors, because that is a very big difference between us and the Paleolithic cultures, is that we are more sedentary than ever. So people who watch less than 2 hours of TV a day had an 80% lower risk of death from cardiovascular disease and 46% lower death from all causes. It's not the TV's fault necessarily, it's not those shows or anything, even though, you know, they're very captivating. It's the fact that we drive to work, most people today, we sit at a desk, we drive home, we sit on our couch to watch TV most of the time, and then we go to bed. So most of our day is spent sitting or laying down and not moving, not utilizing our muscles and expending that energy. And that has very detrimental effects. But you don't have to go to the gym every day. You don't have to join a CrossFit gym. You don't have to work out, really. You just have to move more. You just have to stand more. So the research shows that employees who have a standing desk and work from a standing desk versus sitting down burn up to 75% more calories. So, you know, maybe these people also adopt other health behaviors. 75% is a lot. But standing does require us to engage more of our muscles. It requires more energy. It's better for our posture, it's better for our spine, and yeah, there are a lot of benefits to that. So, is it gonna be more realistic, you think, to make a New Year's resolution to get to the gym 6 days a week for an hour and a half? Or is it more realistic to stand for 2 minutes every hour? Which one will be easier to incorporate into our life? Probably the standing. You don't have to get a fancy standing desk, just pile up some books and put your computer on top. So yeah, I encourage you guys to try it out. If you have one of these smartwatches, it will pester you and let you know it's time to move. Some of us ignore it. Maybe we could start listening. There's also apps that will remind you, because we really do need those cues. After years and years of this behavior and these habits, it's hard to break them. So we need those cues, we need those reminders, let us know, hey, time to stand up, time to move your body. And unfortunately, I won't be able to get into the sleep part today, but also very important. And I brought a list, a sign-up sheet over here, and I have a free download, and it is called How to Lose Weight Without Stepping Foot in the Gym. And it goes into more detail about the movement and the sleep and some of that good stuff. So if you guys want me to send that in your email inbox, then just put your email down, and I'll get that to you. Okay? You guys have any questions?
Where are you on the whole fasting, intermittent fasting deal? What's going on right now?
Yeah, definitely a part of the Paleolithic culture. They had the periods of feast and the periods of famine. I'm a strong proponent of fasting, intermittent fasting for sure. Lots of benefits, autophagy, so that is cellular turnover. So when you're forcing your body to burn up those fat stores, then you're shedding those damaged cells, which can eventually proliferate and turn into things like cancer. Also great for just cognitive functioning. You just feel so much clearer when you give yourself a break. You know, when the first thing you do is you wake up and you fill yourself up with a big breakfast, then your body has to divert a lot of energy to digesting those foods. So it just makes you better fat adapted. And honestly, a diet with these macronutrient ratios, where we're getting about half of our calories from those healthy fats, really eases that transition into intermittent fasting, because we're eating more fat, which makes our body better adapted at using that for fuel, versus relying on carbohydrates, which is what really triggers a lot of cravings for a lot of people.
Is there a number of hours in the fasting that you...
So the research shows like law of diminishing return. After 16 hours, you're not really getting the same results. So that's the sweet spot, is 16 hours. And MCT oil you can have during the fast because it's a fat. And non-caloric beverages, but yeah, 16 hours is the sweet spot. I usually encourage my clients to start with 12 and then work up. If you do have any hormonal troubles, then you want to talk to your doctor about that.
So Leah, does that 16 hours of fasting include my 8 hours of sleep?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So now you're really looking at, I'm making it to dinner time essentially.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like if you have dinner, you finish dinner at 8 p.m., then you don't eat until 8 a.m. Even just that 12-hour window, giving yourself that 12-hour window has a lot of major benefits. Most people can manage that.
Along with some of the lines, is there any real benefit or option not to have 3 meals a day? We're always told you're supposed to eat 3 meals a day. I only like 1 meal a day.
Yeah.
Is there any drawbacks or?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's highly individual. You know, it is, and I think it's based on if you have healthy blood sugar levels and things like that. But personally, I don't think that you need to subscribe to any of those outdated rules. You know, like the 3 dairy a day. They were encouraging low-fat dairy. Well, a lot of our research shows maybe that's not the best option. Same with your meal timing. For sleep, it is encouraged to eat during the daylight hours. So you're going to kind of mess with your circadian rhythm if you're eating into the night time. So your body thinks it's time to start producing melatonin, it's time to relax, settle down, and get to sleep. Then you pump your body with some cereal, lots of sugar and glucose, and it kind of throws off your circadian rhythm. So I think eating in a more narrow window of time, eating to satiety, and is just a good rule of thumb. Any other questions? Those are good questions. All right, well, thank you so much, guys.